welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're looking at something that's, well, increasingly concerning globally. Harmful algal blooms, or HABs. Specifically, what they mean for the safety of the seafood you might be eating.
It's a huge issue, and not just environmental, as you said. It hits health, economies.
Yeah, it's got these big ripple effects.
Absolutely. And these aren't just, simple algae blooms. Some types produce really potent toxins.
Oh, okay.
And we're seeing them pop up more frequently, more intensely. Climate change, pollution, other human activities, they're all kind of feeding into it.
So it damages marine life, obviously, but then it comes back to us.
Exactly. You've got the economic costs, aquaculture, tourism getting hit hard. But the direct human risk often comes from eating contaminated shellfish.
Like mussels.
Mussels are a key example, yeah. They're filter feeders, so they can really concentrate these toxins. Makes them quite vulnerable.
Which brings us neatly to the focus of our deep dive today. We're exploring this really interesting paper comparing consumer attitudes in China, Vietnam, and Chile.
That's right. Looking at how people in these different markets view the risk of HABs in mussels and what they actually prefer when it comes to safety measures.
A truly global perspective, which is great.
It really is. And the goal here is to unpack what drives consumer choices regarding HAB risk in mussels. What do people value? It's crucial for figuring out better food safety policies.
Makes sense.
And actually, this research highlights the kind of work supported by Environment for Development, EfD. They're a global network focused on environmental economics, particularly in the global south. Their support for research like this is vital.
Good to know. Okay, so back to the blooms themselves, the health risks. What are we talking about specifically?
Well, it can range. Sometimes it might be stomach issues, gastroenteritis.
Okay, unpleasant.
But more severe cases, you could be looking at damage to organs, liver, kidneys. It can be serious.
Wow.
And governments do respond, They monitor, they close fisheries sometimes.
Which has its own knock-on effects.
Huge socioeconomic impacts, definitely. And the paper points out, especially where you have lots of informal sellers, consistent regulation is tough.
So consumer risk becomes very real.
Right, which makes understanding consumer preference even more critical. So this study, Chile, China, Vietnam. Why those three? And why mussels again?
It's a great mix. Chile and Vietnam, big mussel producers. China, a massive consumer market. Plus, they produce too.
Ah, okay. Different perspectives.
Exactly. And mussels, well, besides being eaten worldwide, that filter feeding aspect makes them a prime candidate for accumulating HAB toxins. A good test case, really.
So how did the researchers figure out what consumers actually want? How do you measure that preference?
They used a method called a choice experiment.
Okay.
Essentially, you present consumers with different hypothetical choices. Like, which of these mussels would you buy?
And these choices differed somehow?
Yes, based on several key things or attributes.
Such as?
Things like the price, obviously, how they're produced, wild-caught or farmed.
Where they came from, domestic or imported. Whether they use sustainable practices. And the key one here, this hypothetical algal bloom test.
An algal bloom test. Okay, that sounds important. What did that mean in the experiment? Like, what was it guaranteeing?
It represented a really high level of assurance, basically a guarantee that these mussels were extremely unlikely to contain HAB toxins, safe to eat.
And if the test wasn't there?
That represented the status quo. Consumers rely on public warnings, maybe recall information, but there might still be some small residual risk.
Got it. Okay, so you've got these experiments running in 3 different countries. What was the main finding? Did people care about this test?
Overwhelmingly, yes. Across all 3 countries, Chile, China, Vietnam consumers showed a really strong preference for the mussels with the algal bloom test.
Not just a slight preference.
No, it was statistically significant, very clear. It points to a real consumer demand for that kind of safety guarantee.
Which I suppose isn't too surprising given the health risks we talked about.
Exactly. It highlights genuine food safety concerns. People seem willing to prioritize and maybe even pay more to reduce those health risks.
Especially with the HABs becoming more frequent.
Precisely. The worry about contaminated products slipping through seems real for consumers.
Were there other things people cared strongly about besides the test?
Yes, definitely. Sustainable production methods also scored really high in all three countries.
Oh, interesting. So it's not just about personal safety, but broader environmental or ethical concerns, too.
It seems so. But preferences for things like wild versus farmed or domestic versus imported, those varied more.
How so?
Well, Chilean consumers, for example, showed a preference for domestic mussels. In China, maybe a slight preference for farmed. Vietnamese consumers seemed less focused on those particular attributes.
And what about price? Usually a big driver.
It was, generally. In Chile and China, lower prices were preferred, as you'd expect. But in Vietnam, respondents were surprisingly insensitive to price in this specific experiment.
Really? Why would that be?
The researchers floated a couple of ideas. Maybe the rise of eating out in Vietnam plays a role. The focus isn't just on the raw ingredient cost.
Okay.
Or maybe, and this ties into other survey data they collected, Vietnamese consumers might have lower baseline trust in mussel safety, so attributes like the HAB test and sustainability just completely overshadowed the price factor for them. Safety first, basically.
Fascinating. So this demand for the HAB test is clear. Did they try to put a number on it? Like, what would people actually pay for that guarantee?
They did. They estimated the willingness to pay, or WTP.
Right.
And in Chile, it was quite a significant amount in Chilean pesos. A big percentage premium over the standard mussel price.
Wow. And in China?
A similar story, a substantial WTP in Chinese yuan. Again, a notable premium for that added safety feature.
So people aren't just saying they prefer it. They're hypothetically willing to open their wallets for it.
That's what the data suggests. Now, the researchers are careful. It's a hypothetical experiment, so maybe the numbers are a bit inflated.
Sure, hypothetical bias.
Right. Or maybe people see the HAB test as a proxy for overall better quality or safety. Loss aversion, framing of the risk, these things can play a role. But even so, comparing the WTP to actual online prices for regular mussels, say in China, it does suggest a real potential for consumers to pay extra for verified safety.
Okay, so there's this general preference. Did the study dig into why some people might value the test more than others? Any patterns based on individual beliefs or characteristics?
Yes, they looked into that heterogeneity. And one consistent finding across all three countries was about trust.
Trust in what?
Trust in certifications generally. People who believed that certified mussels are safer overall, they were more likely to want and value this specific HAB test.
That makes perfect sense. If you trust the system, you value the specific guarantees it offers.
Exactly. But here's a twist. In Chile and China, they found something counterintuitive. People who perceived the probability of HAB contamination as being higher actually had a lower preference for the test.
Wait, that seems backwards. If you think the risk is high, wouldn't you want the test more?
You'd think so. But the researchers suggest this might signal a lack of trust in the regulatory system's ability to deliver.
Ah, okay. Like, the problem's so bad, I don't even trust that this new test would actually work or be enforced properly.
That's the potential interpretation, a kind of skepticism about effective implementation.
Interesting. What else influenced preferences?
Well, linking back to personal risk in China and Chile, those who strongly believed eating unsafe mussels would seriously harm their health. They had a higher WTP for the test, so perceived severity matters.
Okay, that aligns.
And across all three countries, simply valuing food safety in general was linked to preferring the HAB test. Makes sense. Other things mattered too, like price sensitivity, views on origin, nutrition, even appearance, but the results were a bit more mixed or country-specific there.
So pulling all this together, what does it mean for, say, policymakers or food safety agencies? What are the big implications?
I think the clearest message is that consumers really want this kind of assurance. There's strong demand for HAB testing.
So regulators should encourage or support certification systems.
Precisely. It seems like a robust certification system could really boost consumer trust. It might even increase mussel consumption, paradoxically, because people feel safer, while also, of course, reducing actual health risks.
A potential win-win, then.
Potentially, yes. But, and this is crucial, the credibility is key. Governments need to ensure these systems are transparent, rigorously audited, and properly enforced.
Otherwise, that trust issue comes right back.
Exactly. And public information is important, too. Educating consumers about what these certifications actually mean and why they matter.
And the country differences matter, too, right?
Definitely. Policies probably need tailoring. Like, maybe emphasizing origin is key in Chile, while focusing on production methods makes more sense in China, based on their findings. And This study itself is a great example of tackling a shared global problem through international collaboration. China, Vietnam, Chile researchers working together.
Yeah, that's a really positive aspect. Understanding these different contexts is so important.
It is, because HABs aren't just one country's problem.
Okay, this has been really insightful. If we were to boil it down, what are the main things you'd want our listeners to take away from this deep dive?
I'd say three things. One, there is a strong, clear consumer preference globally, or at least in these key markets, for knowing their mussels are tested for HABs.
Okay.
Two, people seem genuinely willing to pay a premium for that safety assurance.
Right, the WTP.
And three, trust is fundamental. Trust in the certification systems, driven by transparency and reliable information, is what really underpins consumer confidence and willingness to rely on these tests.
And the value of that cross-country research really shines through.
Absolutely. It shows how researchers collaborating internationally, like the work EfD supports, can help us understand these complex, shared challenges like HABs and find solutions that work across different places.
It brings it back to the power of information, doesn't it? For consumers and for policymakers.
It really does. When you, as a consumer, feel informed and can trust the safety systems, you're empowered. And that contributes to making seafood markets safer and more resilient, especially as environmental threats like HABs continue to increase. Transparency really is the bedrock of building that trust.
That's a great point to end on. Building trust through transparency in the face of these growing challenges. Something for all of us to think about regarding our food systems. Thank you so much for sharing all this today.
My pleasure. It's important work.
And thanks again to Environment for Development for their support of this kind of vital global research.